don't do that.
I
was
going to ask
Especially.
you, what is your thought on what's happening in the Everglades, where people are like releasing their pythons into the wild, and the pythons and the gators are battling?
It's kind of Florida's like there's a lot of people I know that are working on invasive species problems, but it's kind of I don't even know enough to really comment. But there's just so much right now that it's kind of hard to imagine any real solution kind of controlling at this point, because there's so many invasive species down there. Pythons are the big one, but there's cobras. I mean, they're like, not super abundant or anything, but they're there. Boas, ball pythons, dozens and dozens of lizard species. So the new there's a guide for the Peterson Guide for reptiles and amphibians in the United States, and it just got updated. Hadn't been updated in like 28 years. And now it's like all the descriptions for all the native stuff got smaller because there was so much introduced species they had to add into it. So there's just lots of stuff.
I heard there's monkeys down there.
There are monkeys. There's parrots.
This is crazy down there.
It's really crazy.
And it's going to be underwater.
Yeah, there's also that. I mean, that's just like again, if you're in Florida and they're working on it, they know more. But at this point, it's kind of like, from my perspective, I don't.
So what would you say to boomers that are buying up Florida real estate property to retire to?
Probably not a smart idea.
It seems like that's
most of my Florida friends. I mean, it's definitely highly likely you're going to have some severe issues, even if it's not completely flooded, with major problems with of weather events that will occur in the near future.
When I was down in Florida, I took a tour on with the pontoon boats, and there's this guy Carl, and his job was to jump off of boats and wrestle the alligators.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
Because to keep the population out of control.
Whoa.
That guy was way rawer than I was.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Wrestling him.
Carl, he would just jump out of the water and just wrestle him.
Wrestle him. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I feel like that's not the best way to deal with the alligator population.
Yeah.
If you've got too many, you probably could do better with hunting them than manually wrestling them. That's probably more of a good way to promote tourism.
There used to be a wildlife show, and when I was growing up, something like Allstate Insurance Wildlife Show, and the guy
Omaha,
Mutual of Omaha,
yeah, Mutual Omaha.
And it was an old guy, and they look at that animal over there. Then he'd have his assistant go and wrestle that animal. He goes, "Go get it, Jim." And he was a young guy, and he'd wrestle maybe a crocodile or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I had Steve Irwin growing up. I feel like that was nice.
Steve Irwin.
Oh yeah, he was a great guy.
He was.
Yeah.
He was less traditional, but he cared about the animals. That was all I really cared about.
Yeah.
I got to see him when I was in Australia, actually, at a zoo.
That is cool.
Before his unfortunate accident.
Yeah, that's terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Wow. Yeah. So, what type of experiments do you?
I mostly do I did a lot of habitat measurements.
Mm-hmm.
Which were not really invasive or anything. It was kind of just like looking at what sort of environments they're using. But now I do a lot of stuff measuring water loss and metabolic rates. So you kind of and thermal tolerances. So like basically put them in a chamber where you've got hot and cold on one side and see what temperatures they prefer. For water loss, you basically put them in a tube and run air over top of them and measure how much oxygen they're using and how much CO2 they're expelling. And
so this is all tied to climate change, like how their microclimates, like how the climate change will affect their microclimate?
Yes, and I mean, it's more general than that, but it will be used for that. So I'm using those sorts of data. So the thermal data and then metabolic rate and water loss data can then be put into, so there's ways to model how species are going to be distributed. So one way is you have presence points of the animals, so you know where they are, and then you can take environmental data, so some sort of climate data, and you can say, okay, these are where they are, and now what happens when we change the climate? How will their distribution potentially change? So what's the probability we expect them to occur based on the environment they're currently using, based on areas we know that they occur? So that's like correlative models. So it's a little more straightforward. You need to know where the species are, and then you have some environmental data. The stuff I'm doing is a mechanistic model where you have physiology data. So what kind of temperatures what kind of conditions can they persist in? And then you use those data with the environmental data to then kind of understand how they biologically would be able to occur in specific locations. And then on top of that, there's the climate data. We can take like climate data from the coarse scale, so like a 1 kilometer resolution. And then there's models that we can predict, like, okay, under these conditions, this is what it's going to be like 10 centimeters below the soil, what's it going to be like 1 meter above the ground or under shade. So you can kind of use those data to then be like, okay, this animal is allowed to climb or burrow, and then where will they be able to occur, and when will they be able to be active based on their physiology. So like what kind of temperatures they can deal with. So it's kind of directly linked to what they can deal with.
Ooh.
Yeah.